was a quiet evening, the kind where the sun dipped just below the city, skyline, bathing the streets in a golden haze. He was almost home after a long shift, his uniform slightly rumpled, and his eyes tired from the weight of a job that never really ended. His thoughts wandered to dinner, to his wife, who had probably already begun to worry, and to his little boy waiting for a hint, a bedtime story.
I think it has potential,
just a few more
but
turns,
we need to address
a few more
key areas.
Minutes, and he would be back in the warmth of his home. That was when he saw her. She was standing on the sidewalk, one hand pressed to her forehead, the other clutched to her side. Her steps were uneven, as though the ground itself was unstable. She looked up at him with a helpless expression, confused, frightened, vulnerable. Without a second thought, he slowed the patrol vehicle and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm, professional. She nodded faintly, but her body said otherwise. I feel lightheaded," she murmured, barely audible. He stepped out immediately and guided her to the passenger seat. It was standard protocol to assist a citizen in need. There was no reason to hesitate. Once she was seated, he offered her a bottle of water and asked if she needed to go to a clinic. She shook her head. He stood by the open door for a moment, waiting to see if she would recover. Then, the world shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow fade to black. One moment, he was reaching for his radio, and the next, he was back in his apartment, sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at the digital clock. His uniform still clung to his body, the car keys were on the table, and he felt hollow. Something had happened. Something had been lost. The call came early the next morning. A superior's voice, stern and clipped. "You're to report to headquarters immediately." He didn't understand. Why? Until he arrived. The video was already making rounds. Online, someone had filmed her, stumbling out of his patrol car, visibly shaken. The angle was distant, taken from behind, a parked motorbike, but the commentary, dubbed over the clip, left little room for interpretation. Accusations of misconduct, of taking advantage of a woman in distress. The comment section was a wildfire. Words like predator, abuse of power, and shame to the force scrolled endlessly under the video. In less than 12 hours, his reputation was shattered. His commander didn't yell. That was somehow worse. The man simply looked at him with disappointment, sliding a suspension notice across the desk. "Effective immediately," he said, "pending investigation." No one asked him what had happened. No one questioned the gap in his memory. At home, the silence was heavier than the headlines. His wife sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling as she stared at her phone. Her mother was already calling for answers. His son, too young to understand, watched quietly from the hallway. And his own adoptive mother, silent but not doubtful. She knew her son. She had raised him to value decency, to be fair and respectful. Her eyes told him she still believed him, even when no one else did. But belief wasn't enough to stop what came next. The media swarmed. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Neighbors whispered. Some averted their eyes. Others stared. Online, his face was dissected, ridiculed, condemned. The department's spokesperson released a statement emphasizing their zero-tolerance policy and commitment to upholding justice no matter who was involved. He was alone. He replayed the memory over and over, trying to patch the hole. He remembered helping her into the car, remembered her face, pale and dazed. He remembered opening the bottle of water, and then nothing. It gnawed at him, the way that moment just disappeared. He started questioning his own mind. Was he drugged? Was something slipped into his drink earlier that day? He hadn't eaten dinner. Could exhaustion do that to him? His gut told him something was wrong, something orchestrated. And then came the rumor. A neighbor mentioned that the woman was seen with a man earlier, a man who often carried a phone, filming odd situations around the neighborhood. That detail struck like lightning. What if it was a setup? he dug deeper, quietly reaching out to people he trusted. A friend from the precinct agreed to check traffic camera footage. Another old classmate worked a tea and offered to analyze the metadata from the viral video. Slowly, fragments emerged. The man filming had been present before. The woman even approached the patrol car. The camera had been rolling too, perfectly, the angle too well framed for an impromptu recording. It wasn't evidence, not yet, but it was a start. He decided to confront them, not rashly, carefully. He visited the market where she worked, waited until he saw her and the man together. When he approached, she looked startled. The man, defensive. He asked simple questions. Why was she there that night? Did she remember what happened? Did she know the man had been filming? Her answers were vague. The man scoffed, dismissing it all as coincidence. But their unease gave them away. They hadn't expected him to dig. Meanwhile, the damage to his personal life deepened. His wife distanced herself, unsure what to believe. Her mother became openly hostile, blaming his past, his work, even his mother. Only his adoptive mother stood firm. She went to the woman's home herself, not to threaten, but to seek clarity. Her tone was calm, but her words sharp. She had raised her son to be honorable. She had suffered enough disgrace in life. Her own criminal past still followed her like a shadow, but she had found redemption in motherhood. Now she demanded truth. The woman offered nothing, only silence. The man stood in the background, arms crossed. Later that evening, his mother returned home and sat beside him. You have to fight this, she said, not just for your name, but for every decent man who's been torn down by lies. And so he fought. He filed a formal request for an internal review. He hired a private investigator with the help of a loan. He gathered statements from people who knew him, testimonies of his character, his work ethic, his empathy. Bit by bit, a new story began to emerge. One that wasn't about shame, but sabotage. But public opinion doesn't shift overnight. And in the shadows of doubt, even the truth feels like a fragile thread. Still, he held on to it, knowing that only through patience, persistence, and unwavering resolve could he clear his name and rebuild what was broken. As the days stretched on, he waited, not just for justice, but for the moment when the world would look at him again and finally see the truth. The days that followed were a storm of uncertainty. Though suspended, he refused to fall into the inertia of waiting. Every waking moment was filled with investigation, reflection, and quiet. Rage held beneath a calm exterior. His morning started not with uniform, checks or roll calls, but with cups of cold coffee and the hum of his laptop as he traced digital footprints, camera, angles, and timestamps. He wasn't just trying to prove his innocence anymore. He was trying to understand why. Why him? Why now? What did they gain from destroying him? The question gnawed at his conscience like rust on steel. Meanwhile, whispers around the town. Neighborhood grew. Some of his former colleagues distanced themselves, afraid to be associated with a scandal. Others watched silently, unsure what to believe. Only a few dared to offer him quiet, support, a pat on the back, a text, without words, just a single emoji that said, "I'm still here." He clung to those like life vests in an ocean of doubt. His wife, now staying mostly at her mother's place, sent messages about their son, never about him. He asked, "About you today." He wants his bedtime story. It was as if she had divided the man she married from the man in the video. He didn't blame her. She had grown up in a world that taught women to fear, to react, to run from, smoke even before the fire was confirmed. And this time, he couldn't give her a reason not to. He understood, but it still hurt. He watched the viral clip again and again, not to torture himself, but to study it. The woman's expression, her body, language, the way she moved, none of it felt genuine. The way the man filming stayed out of frame, yet ensured everything else was, in view, reeked of manipulation. One afternoon, while reviewing the file, he noticed something new, a car parked. Across the street, partially visible in the corner of the shot, a silver sedan. He paused the frame, zoomed in. It was blurry, but the license plate was just legible enough. He jotted it down and called in a favor from an old contact at the DMV. A few hours later, the call came back. The car was registered to the man who filmed the clip. Now there was a thread, and he began to pull. He discovered that the man had a history of involvement in staged altercations, fake accidents, and minor scams. Several years ago, he was accused of staging a street robbery for social media clout, but the charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence. It was enough to stir suspicion, but not enough to clear him. Still, he persisted. With his private investigators' help, they traced the man's recent calls, bank transfers, and social media interactions. They found something strange, a large deposit from an unknown account just 2 days before the incident. It wasn't from a known employer or family. It was discreet, silent, suspicious. When he presented this to a retired police captain he trusted, the man narrowed his eyes and said, "You've got a motive. Now get a confession." That night's sleep didn't come. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, mind buzzing. He remembered the woman's face, not in fear, but in control. She had cried on camera but looked indifferent at the police station. When asked if she needed medical attention, she declined. When offered counseling, she shrugged. She was playing a role and playing it well. His mother, resolute as ever, came into the room holding an envelope. "I found this," she said, placing it on the table. Inside were printed messages from an online forum where the man had once boasted anonymously about ruining someone big soon. The timestamps matched the week before the incident. It was circumstantial, but it showed intent. Armed with this, he returned to the scene of the accusation, the sidewalk, where it all began. He stood there at sunset, retracing each step. A nearby shopkeeper recognized him. "You're the guy from the video," the man said. His tone wasn't judgmental, just curious. When asked if he remembered the woman, the shopkeeper nodded. She wasn't acting sick when she arrived. She stood here for almost 15 minutes, checking her phone. Then she saw you drive up and suddenly looked dizzy. That was the crack in the wall he'd been waiting for. The next day, he compiled everything: the financial trail, the car registration, the forum messages, the shopkeeper's statement, and took it to an internal affairs officer he had once worked with. The man agreed to quietly review the evidence. "I can't promise anything," he said, "but this changes things." While waiting for progress, the silence became its own kind of torture. His mother stayed close, always cooking, always tidying, as if controlling the house might somehow fix the world outside it. One evening, she shared a memory from her time in prison. "They believed I was a monster," she said. "Even after I was out, no one looked at me the same. Not until you. You believed I could be more." He looked at her, realizing just how much strength it took to survive that kind of judgment. He wondered if he had it too. Then came the breakthrough. The internal affairs officer called. "We ran a background check on the woman. She used to work at a nightclub that was closed due to illegal activity. Your man, our videographer, was a frequent visitor. It's possible they've known each other for years." The pieces clicked together, like magnets. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. But still, it lacked a confession. He needed to confront them again, but this time with leverage. He met them at the same market under the guise of casual conversation. The man laughed him off. "Still chasing ghosts?" he sneered. That's when he laid the evidence on the table, figuratively and literally. Photos, screenshots, testimonies. He watched the woman's face pale as the color drained from her cheeks. "This is blackmail," the man barked. "No," replied calmly. "This is truth, and I'm giving you one chance to come clean before I take this public and let the whole world see who you really are." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't hesitation, it was fear. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. That was enough. Not a full confession, but enough to reopen the investigation." The report was submitted, and a new inquiry began. This time, he was not the defendant. He was the accuser. Within weeks, the narrative shifted. News outlets that once crucified him now tiptoed around the story carefully, using words like new developments and possible manipulation. His suspension was lifted pending final review. He returned home to find his son waiting, with open arms and a storybook in hand. His wife, still cautious, said little, but the door was open. That night, he sat by the window and watched the lights of the city blink like distant stars. He wasn't vindicated yet, but he had taken back something vital, his voice. The war wasn't over, but he had reclaimed the battlefield. And with that, for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. He returned to work like a shadow, trying to reclaim its place, but nothing was the same anymore. Though the suspension had been lifted, the air around him remained thick with uncertainty. The accusation may have started to fade from official records, but in the eyes of many, the stain was not yet gone. Some colleagues greeted him with hesitant nods, others with veiled glances and awkward silences. But he didn't return for their validation. He was no longer driven by duty alone. He was now fueled by something more personal, more consuming, the need to find out the truth in its entirety, not just for himself, but for anyone who might be forced into the same dark place without warning. Every morning, he clocked in like any other officer, focused on files and assigned duties. But as night fell, he transformed. He became a quiet investigator digging through the debris of the lie that almost destroyed his life. It started with the phone. By a thread of digital evidence, he managed to get into the call and message logs of the man who had recorded the video, the one that had circulated like wildfire and turned suspicion into assumed guilt. Among the ordinary entries was a string of text messages exchanged with a number not saved in the contact list. Messages like, "It's done. She played her part perfectly," and Phase 2 sent chills down his spine. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. Using old surveillance skills, he tracked the number to a rented apartment on the edge of the city. A temporary lease, paid in cash, no ID, no cameras. It was the kind of place used by people who wanted to disappear between deeds. He went alone, not wanting to risk interference or warning. As he stood outside the door, slightly ajar, voices slipped through. A man's low, cocky tone. "As long as she keeps her mouth shut, there's no proof. Everything else is wiped." Then the unmistakable voice of the woman who accused him, sounding uncertain. "But he didn't do anything. He just helped me when I said I felt faint. I didn't know it would go this far." The man snapped, "Don't grow a conscience. Now, you forget who bailed you out of your debt?" That was enough. He pushed the door open, startling them both. The man flinched, ready to bolt, but stopped when their eyes locked. There was no need for violence, just the heavy silence of reckoning. The woman sat down, her eyes darting from wall to floor to ceiling, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm not here for an apology," he said quietly, voice calm, but firm. "I'm here for the truth, not just for me, for the law," she cracked. The pressure was too much. With trembling hands and tears that seemed more regret than fear, she whispered, "I'm sorry, I didn't think it would go this far. I thought it would just be a way out. Quick money, a lie that would vanish." Her confession was recorded. There were no threats, no coercion, just raw, undeniable truth. Days later, he submitted everything to his superiors, the texts, the location, the confession. An internal investigation was reopened, this time with direction and purpose. The tide shifted. Those who once whispered behind his back now looked at him with a mix of admiration and shame. But the battle wasn't over. The woman and her accomplice were arrested, charged with defamation, false reporting, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Public opinion, once cold and condemning, began to thaw. News articles painted a different picture now. A wrongfully accused officer who stood firm in the face of humiliation and uncovered a deeper rot beneath the surface. But redemption, even when public, didn't undo the damage. His family had lived through weeks of torment. His wife, once torn between belief and doubt, now looked at him with quiet sorrow, forever hesitating. His foster mother, the one who had stood by him through everything, grew more fragile with worry each day. The night he returned home after the truth broke, she held his face in her weathered hands and said, "You were always good. I never doubted it, but I was afraid the world wouldn't care." He didn't cry. He hadn't since the day he was suspended. But something in that moment, something in the way her voice cracked, made his throat tighten. Meanwhile, at the station, he was offered a commendation, even a promotion, but he refused. He wasn't ready to celebrate. He took leave instead, needing time to breathe, to think, to recover. He spent days walking alone in quiet parks, watching children play and old couples feed birds. The world had moved on, but he was still catching up. One evening, he visited the very spot where it had all started, the road where he had first encountered the woman, asking for help. He stood there, retracing the moment in his mind, the concern he had felt, the instinct to assist, the sudden blackout, the confusion, and then the betrayal. What had they done to him in that short time? Had they drugged him? The tests were inconclusive. Time had washed away physical evidence, but the psychological scars remained. The breach of trust, of his values, of the very system he had sworn to uphold was harder to mend. A week later, he met with internal affairs one final time. They asked if he wanted to press charges beyond what had been filed, sue for emotional distress, wrongful suspension, reputation damage. He thought long and hard before answering. "No," he said simply. "What I want is better screening, better support systems. We can't let false claims destroy real service, but we also can't let true victims be afraid to speak." They nodded. And then, as if a page turned, he stood, thanked them, and left. Months passed. Life regained rhythm. His badge was polished again. People saluted him differently now, with respect earned through adversity. But deep down, he had changed. He was no longer just a police officer. He had become a mirror, one that reflected both the flaws and the strength of the justice system. And though the case was closed, his mission wasn't. Now he began mentoring new recruits, sharing his story not for sympathy, but for awareness. Justice, he told them, isn't just about catching criminals. It's about protecting truth, even when no one believes you, and when someone asked him if he regretted helping that woman on the road, he answered without hesitation, no. Helping was never the mistake. The mistake would have been letting this turn me bitter. The room was silent, but something shifted. In the stillness, there was strength, the same kind he had found in himself, broken, bruised, but never beaten.